Individual debt continues to balloon in Canada. I'm Marco Perri. Welcome to the Perri platform. I feel like what I'm about to say today is shocking, but at the same time, we kind of already knew it. BNN Bloomberg reports that nearly half of Canadians are facing a debt trap. Before we get into that, it's important to understand what exactly a debt trap is. Picture a situation where you have a debt of $1,000. Maybe you can only afford to pay back $200 every month. You will foreseeably pay it back in 5 months. 5 times 200 is 1,000. The complicating factor here is the interest payments. In this hypothetical situation, if the interest every month is $200, you found yourself in a debt trap. You can make the contributions you plan to make every month, but from here until infinity, it will never be paid off because all you're doing is paying the interest. You're not actually reducing the principal at all. A debt trap can also be a situation where it's difficult to pay it back. In that first situation, it was pretty much impossible, but maybe the interest is $200 and you can pay, say, $205. You're only really making a minuscule dent into that debt. Bloomberg is saying that nearly half of Canadians are in a situation like that. They conducted a survey and found that 47% of the respondents do not expect to cover basic living expenses over the next year without taking on more debt. It's a self-fulfilling cycle of more debt, just to live. The first thing to note here is the survey recruited 2,000 Canadians and they're using that number to project across the entire nation. It may seem like a small amount for a country with over 30 million people, but in the world of statistics, it's fairly secure. They do the same thing with election polls and pretty much every single piece of market research that's ever been done. The survey also found that 48% of respondents had less than $200 remaining at the end of the month after covering living and debt expenses. So you have two groups here, and there may be some overlap between them. You can foresee needing more loans to cover expenses in the future, even if you have some money left over due to another upcoming future expense like maybe having a child. Having less than $200 left over every month doesn't put anyone in a good position. It complicates any savings that you plan on creating, it hinders retirement funding, and leaves you one surprise emergency away from bankruptcy. Now, if you average out the data from everyone who took the survey, the average money left over after paying bills every month is $550 across Canada, which is not a whole lot either. Averages are a little tricky because the lowest someone can have left over is theoretically zero. You can incur debt beyond that, but in the survey you would indicate that your surplus income is negative $2,000. It doesn't work like that. On the flip side, you can go as high as infinity theoretically if you're a big shot millionaire or billionaire. Despite that, we arrived at the figure of $550. That's down $140 from June when they conducted a similar study. The trend shows people are unable to retain their income and, as time goes on, it's becoming more difficult. It's actually at its lowest point since 2016, which is as far as Bloomberg provides data for. We're not in a good spot right now. So what expenses are keeping Canada in the hole? The first that probably comes to mind and affects a lot of people is housing. The price to buy or rent has skyrocketed, and you're likely overextending yourself just for a place to live. Toronto and Vancouver are both in the top 10 most overvalued real estate markets in the world, according to UBS. Lots of other areas are following suit in terms of increasing prices in Canada, which doesn't make sense, especially the area around those markets. As people can't afford to live in the hubs themselves, they need to find another place to reside. They expand out a little bit, and that expansion pushes the prices higher in those areas. The factors that contribute to the housing issues are multivariate. You have foreign ownership, zoning bylaws that are too strict, building across instead of building upwards, poor transit, and the list goes on and on. They're all really long-term issues though. Without tackling them at the root, governments run the risk of simply pushing back the problem into the future. The first-time home buyer incentive strikes me as one of these band-aids. It may even encourage people to overextend themselves to reap the benefit of this program. It's very likely if you cannot afford a house before it, you still can't even with it because you would just become house poor if you did go ahead and purchase something. That's to say, a large portion of your income would just go towards these bills and you might find yourself in a debt trap of your own creation. There's also student loans which hold back another chunk of the populace. It does not seem wise to me to burden citizens at the stage that they are most likely to try and take financial risk. Creating a business or an entrepreneurial venture, it's far easier when you are young without many responsibilities. Being in debt might hold you back from that. And in turn, that doesn't help our economy because we have less small businesses and people actually creating jobs for us. I don't think free education is the only answer here either. You can handle this in numerous ways that would all work and supposedly appease both sides of the argument. You can allow students to enjoy interest-free grace periods for a longer duration. Making them pay it back 6 months or even 1 year after graduation might be too strict of a deadline. You can also do things like make textbooks more affordable and force universities to stop requiring the latest edition of a textbook that comes with a single extra sentence input somewhere. It's a pretty sneaky marketing tactic, and it funnels revenue into the textbook manufacturers, but at a great cost to our students. Of course, if there's something groundbreaking that they have to make a new textbook about, they found a new development in photon laser beams, then of course. But if all you're doing is making a minuscule change, correcting a typo, it's pretty asinine. So at the end of the day though, university really is an investment. Spending thousands of dollars on a certification that does not have strong job prospects is not all that wise. You aren't entitled to a middle income lifestyle simply because you have a degree. That's a thing of the past, and the perception should not exist anymore in today's market. Nearly everyone has some form of degree or certificate from a post-secondary education. Canada, in reality, has a labor shortage because our domestic students are not in sync with our market needs right now. Difficulty in finding jobs is an issue that a lot of people would cite, but for employers, they also have a difficulty in finding employees. CTV reported that 41% of Canadian employers reported difficulty in filling vacant job positions. It's a matter of where we are looking and what skill sets that the person can bring to the table. To think a degree in dance theory is equivalent to one in STEM is wrong. That does not mean that everyone has to simply flood the STEM fields right now, but clearly a misalignment has occurred. When that many employers can't fill jobs and we have that many people who can't find a job, there's a problem. People are not thinking along the same lines. I digress though. Canadians are in a hole right now, and it's troubling given our talk of a looming recession. In 2008, the banks fell due to people defaulting on large loans, particularly with housing because people overextended themselves. It took loans that they could not afford to pay back realistically, and when the banks came to collect, they could not afford to pay it back. The report cites nearly half of Canada is looking to take on more debt to cover basic living expenses. That does not bode well. If a recession occurs, people are likely to lose jobs. We don't know to what degree. It depends on how intense the recession is, but we can expect some variance there. We can expect some loss to happen. Consumer spending will drop, and companies will earn less, which further develops the cycle of job loss and whatnot. The banks want to be paid their loans back, but the people who have these loans are further strapped for cash, either due to layoffs or still needing more loans to cover their future expenses, even their current living expenses. Trying to get the principal loan back from a populace where half the country is in debt, it's a very difficult thing to accomplish. In the past, governments could always ramp up spending by lowering interest rates, but ours are already very low. There isn't much wiggle room. If you made the interest rates lower, people would see that and be like, oh, it doesn't cost too much to borrow right now. Maybe it's a good time to buy that car, buy that house, and whatnot. You can spur the economy that way. But with the rates where they are right now, where do you go to 0%? What incentive is there to loan money then? Or even at that, 0% is not a big jump. You have to go into these negative interest rates where you pay people to actually take loans and buy stuff. When you ride the wave of low interest rates for too long, that is where you inevitably will end up. So if banks can't get their capital back from people who have taken loans, it puts them in a vulnerable position. You can further develop this rabbit hole and imagine people losing trust in a bank. They want their money right now because they fear for bankruptcy. They look to withdraw all their deposits and the banks not having enough cash to meet the demand end up going bankrupt. It's another self-fulfilling prophecy right there. There's a lot of those in a recession scenario. So I'm not making the case that this will happen, but it's possible. The debt climate in Canada makes things especially difficult to navigate and likely to go down that route. Simply put, too many Canadians are struggling. The percentages are obscene. Having half your country expecting to need more loans to just cover basic living expenses is not an indicator of a successful society. To make matters worse, it's not even evident what the best way to deal with this is. Politicians with a one answer promised everything are just delusional and they're trying to get the best of you. It's a multivariate situation. I believe that housing is the biggest problem right now, but even within that, there's dozens of things to account for within it. The list of problems is seemingly endless right now. The bottom line is the government has to think more long term. The band-aids do not help the country for long. We need better transit to expand what's considered a livable area. Tokyo has that figured out. The outskirts are connected, and they don't become outskirts anymore. You can commute to the core from very far off, and it allows you to live further away. More land, more housing. And also, you need to start building upwards. In Canada and North America, we've kind of developed the idea of having a house on 1 acre of land, and it's just one family there. Again, I'll reference Tokyo. They built upwards. It's a lot of complexes, and even within those complexes, you can have a store at the bottom. Comes to those zoning bylaws too. A little bit too strict here in Canada. We should also look into cracking down on money laundering and foreign investment into housing. Having a bunch of foreign nationals come in and take up the market, leaving houses vacant, and not being put to use by Canadian citizens is not a good idea. Then you have student loan debt. It should be prodded and made less constricting. I'd even make the argument that we need to do better to advertise where Canada needs people for jobs. We have a shortage in areas that require specialized skills. We are forced to import talent from across the world because we don't have that internally. Canada would do better to emphasize that and train people where we need them to be trained in. If Trudeau can tackle some of these areas during his term, that would be ideal. But the government seems more focused on the short term, which is not conductive of success, and you can make the claim that that line of thinking is what got us here in the first place. Now, my final point, so it's true that a lot of Canadians are in debt right now at the individual level, but even on a countrywide basis, Canada is in crippling debt itself. As a nation, we owe other countries and lenders over $760 billion. Now, imagine how much interest we pay on that every year. Whenever we ask the government for free stuff, it comes out of that. We add more debt onto the nation's total. The government has 2 ways, or maybe 3, to respond to that. They can increase taxes, that's one of their major sources of revenue. They can try and export more stuff to other countries, another source of revenue. Or 3, they can just do nothing and take the debt. And it really matters how seriously you view the issue. You can see it as not a big deal, we want our stuff now, and debt doesn't matter, we'll pay it off sometime in the future. By doing that, you pass the buck onto the next generation. You can also make the case, maybe it doesn't matter. A lot of countries are in debt. America is way worse off than we are. My response to that would be it's a toxic mentality. You would not apply that to your own personal situation, so why apply it to the country where it's more than just yourself at risk? This concept of a debt trap, it's very interesting, especially on the federal level. If we keep ramping up our debt and not paying it off swiftly, the time will come where the interest that we pay on it is becoming insurmountable. We can't pay off the debt because the interest is too high. It's a situation that seemingly is affecting almost half of the country. We don't want it to affect the head of government as well. Debt is a very powerful instrument, and I wouldn't take it very lightly at the individual or the countrywide level. This, of course, has been something that politicians don't want to talk about, and trying to get the budget in order is seemingly out of fashion. There are a lot of things that we as a country need right now, but at the same time, we can't really afford it without the debt. It's very similar when you compare it to the individual situation. We need these necessities, and if we can't afford to pay for it, we need to take on debt. The real answer is fixing these fundamental issues within the individual society and expanding that out to the countrywide basis as well. What is a necessity on the countrywide basis? How can we make more money? How can we get rid of this debt? Those are questions the government has to talk about a little bit more, and citizens have to be made aware that if debt can cripple you, it can cripple the country as well. Unless, of course, your endgame plan is to just declare bankruptcy and not pay back any of the countries and the lenders. I would be very interested to see how they react to that. It would probably lead to some wartime efforts and massive economic collapses for Canada. So that brings me to the end of today's conversation. If you enjoyed the content, be sure to leave a review and share. You can also find me on Twitter, and I made a new Instagram account at Perri Platform. I'm going to be posting like little snippets and news articles on there, so give me a follow at Perri Platform on Twitter and Instagram. I'll see you soon.